Revenge isn't always fire. Sometimes it's ice. You stop arguing. You stop defending. You stop explaining yourself to people who already decided what version of you they want to believe. That's when you begin to see it, the architecture of control. Not loud, not violent, but quiet, precise, surgical. Most people think manipulation is something that happens in toxic relationships. A raised voice, a guilt trip, a threat. They're wrong. True manipulation doesn't need sound. It just needs access. Every manipulator builds their empire the same way, not by overpowering your will but by reprogramming it. They don't force you to obey. They make you want to. They study your reactions like a surgeon studies anatomy, tracing which words make you shrink, which silences make you panic, which gestures make you seek approval. And once they find the map of your emotions, they start drawing roads that lead exactly where they want. That's the first truth you must understand. Control doesn't begin with dominance. It begins with understanding. And manipulators understand you better than you understand yourself. Mind game 1. The illusion of choice ***. They offer you two paths, both leading to their benefit. You think you're deciding. You're not. This is one of the oldest tricks in behavioral psychology, the illusion of autonomy. You feel free because you're choosing, but your every option was pre-designed to serve someone else's agenda. It's like being handed a cage painted in 2 colors, and being asked which one you prefer to live in. They'll say, "Do you want to talk now or later? Do you want to help me or let me down?" Either way, you're already dancing to their tune. What they don't tell you is that real freedom isn't about having choices, it's about having exit routes. Manipulators make sure you never notice when those exits quietly disappear. 2. The currency of guilt ***. When control can't be enforced through logic, it's enforced through guilt. And guilt, that's the most obedient emotion of all. They'll remind you of every favor they did, every moment they stood by you, every sacrifice they never asked for but now demand payment for. They weaponize your empathy, and every time you feel bad for disappointing them, they get stronger. Here's the cruel truth. Guilt is not a sign of morality. It's a sign of conditioning. You were taught to feel guilty when you shouldn't, to equate peace with selfishness. Manipulators know this. They exploit it. They'll say, "I thought you were different. I guess I was wrong about you." Simple sentences, but behind them, a loaded gun aimed straight at your conscience. You begin to question yourself. Maybe I am being too cold. Maybe I should explain. Maybe I owe them this. And just like that, you're trapped not by force but by shame. 3. The mirror of empathy ***. They reflect your emotions back at you, perfectly, almost eerily. They'll mimic your tone, your expressions, even your dreams. They make you feel understood, and that's the bait. Because once you believe someone truly gets you, you lower your walls. You reveal your insecurities. You hand them the blueprint to your mind. And when the time comes, they'll use that blueprint like a weapon. This is what psychologists call emotional mirroring, a subconscious tactic to build rapid trust. In the hands of a manipulator, it becomes a weaponized form of intimacy. They don't seduce you with attraction. They seduce you with understanding. And the deeper you feel seen, the more blind you become. Here's what most people never realize until it's too late. Manipulators don't take your power, they make you give it away. Voluntarily, gratefully. They build a story where you are the hero, but they're the narrator. You think you're acting on free will, but your script was written long before you spoke your first line. That's why some of the most dangerous manipulators never shout, never threaten, never demand. They whisper, they smile, they listen just enough to make you trust the silence between their words. Because silence, in the hands of a manipulator, isn't absence. It's a mirror, and it makes you project your own hopes, fears, and logic onto someone who's already calculated your every move. So you start to lose your balance, slowly. You begin to think like them, justify them, defend them. You tell yourself, they're not that bad. Because the alternative, accepting that you've been played, feels unbearable. That's how control evolves. Not as domination, but as dependency. And dependency wears many masks. Love, loyalty, compassion, even pity. The deeper truth? You don't stay because you're weak. You stay because you've been rewired to believe that leaving equals betrayal. And that's not manipulation, that's psychological engineering. Every manipulator studies one thing above all: your emotional oxygen. The thing you can't live without: validation, peace, affection, or closure. They'll cut off your air just long enough for you to come crawling back. And then they'll breathe life into you again, not as mercy, but as proof of their control. That's how dependency becomes devotion, and devotion becomes self-destruction. But here's what they never expect. When you finally recognize the pattern, the spell shatters. Because awareness is the one thing they can't control. The moment you start watching the game instead of playing it, the power shifts. You stop reacting. You start observing. And suddenly, the manipulator loses their greatest weapon: your emotional predictability. They taught you to feel guilty for protecting yourself. They taught you to believe that silence is cruelty. But what they never understood is that silence can also be freedom. And that's where your awakening begins. The theater of control ***. They don't enter your life to love you. They enter to study you. Every conversation is a data collection, every silence a test. They're not interested in who you are, only in who you can be for them. And once they understand that, the show begins. A carefully crafted theater of emotions, where you are both the performer and the audience, applauding the very act that destroys you. Because the cruel genius of manipulation isn't control through dominance. It's control through perception. 4. The reversal of reality ***. At some point, it happens. A moment so small you almost miss it. You confront them about something, maybe a lie, a betrayal, an inconsistency. And what do? They flip it. Effortlessly. Suddenly, you're the one apologizing. You're the one who overreacted. You're the one who misunderstood. This is called gaslighting, but that word barely captures the art behind it. It's not just lying. It's the reconstruction of your entire sense of truth. They twist facts not to confuse you, but to make you question yourself. And once your self-trust fractures, they become the only stable voice left in your world. That's the real goal, not to convince you they're right, but to convince you that you can no longer trust your own perception. Because a confused mind is an obedient mind. And obedience disguised as love is the manipulator's masterpiece. They'll say things like, "You're remembering it wrong. You always exaggerate. Why are you so sensitive?" Each phrase a quiet incision, cutting away your confidence one word at a time. You start editing yourself before you even speak. You second-guess your emotions, your tone, your memories. And that's when they win, because now you're policing yourself for them. Here's the cruel truth most people never face. Manipulators don't erase your strength. They redirect it. They make you use it against yourself. 5. Intermittent reinforcement. The science behind addiction isn't chemistry. It's unpredictability. When you don't know whether the next moment brings pain or pleasure, your brain locks in, obsessed with prediction, craving resolution. Manipulators know this. They make affection a slot machine, unpredictable, irregular, addictive. One day they love you, the next day they're distant. One message melts your heart, the next silence breaks it. And in that emotional chaos, you start chasing the high of their approval. You tell yourself, if I just do better, they'll come back. But they don't come back because of your effort. They come back because you're hooked. It's not romance. It's behavioral conditioning. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement, and it's the same technique used to train animals. But in the human realm, it's far more devastating. Because when affection becomes unpredictable, it becomes sacred. You start worshiping what you used to expect. They withdraw attention until your self-worth shrinks. Then, just as you're about to break, they offer warmth again and you feel alive. You mistake relief for love, inconsistency for depth, and chaos for passion. And by the time you realize it, you're not in love with the person, you're addicted to the pattern. That's the point where most people lose themselves. They start defending their captor. They justify the cruelty. They call the pain connection. Because the mind can endure almost anything except meaninglessness. So it invents meaning where there is none. It calls manipulation fate. And that's how the cycle sustains itself, not by logic, but by emotional illusion. 6. The weaponized confession ***. At first, they tell you everything. Their trauma, their heartbreak, their loneliness feels intimate, real, vulnerable. You open up too because reciprocity feels like trust. But later, every confession you made becomes every fear becomes a tool of control. When you argue, they'll pull from your deepest wounds. No wonder your last relationship failed. Everyone eventually leaves you, don't they? I thought you were different, but you're proving me right. They use your honesty as a weapon against you, and you start hiding your truth even from yourself. That's how the manipulator evolves from lover to warden. And the walls of your own vulnerability become your prison. They pretend to be fragile, but make no mistake, their fragility is strategic. It makes you protect them instead of yourself. You feel guilty for hurting them, even when they're the one who caused the pain. This is what I call the paradox of emotional inversion. They create the wound, then force you to feel sorry for them bleeding. It's not empathy. It's emotional inversion at its purest form, where compassion becomes control and guilt becomes obedience. You begin to walk on eggshells, not because you fear their anger, but because you fear their sadness. You start adjusting your behavior to avoid seeing disappointment in their eyes. And that's when you've crossed the invisible line, the moment your empathy becomes submission. Here's what they don't tell you. Manipulation doesn't need authority. It only needs your conscience. The disorientation phase. Eventually, your reality feels like fog. You stop recognizing your own reactions. You start apologizing for emotions you didn't even feel wrong about. You catch yourself saying sorry when you're the one who was hurt. This is how identity erodes. Not all at once, but by 1,000 tiny cuts of self-doubt. And in that hollow space, they plant a new belief system, one where your worth depends on their perception. They become your moral compass, your judge, your savior, and your executioner. You think this is connection, but it's colonization, emotional colonization. They'll convince you that they're the only one who gets you. They isolate you subtly, making others seem dangerous, disloyal, or shallow. Soon, their voice replaces your inner one. Their logic becomes your logic. Their truth, your truth. And that's when control is complete. But the irony is, the manipulator isn't free either. They're trapped in their own fear of insignificance. They control because they can't connect. They dominate because they can't be seen without the mask. And that's their punishment, to be surrounded by people they've trained to love the illusion, not the person. You start to see it now. The pattern isn't random. It's engineered. The affection, the silence, the guilt, the praise. All perfectly timed instruments in a symphony of control. But every performance has an ending. And when the lights finally dim, only one question remains. Will you keep playing the role they wrote for you, or will you walk off the stage? The anatomy of control ***. The human mind is a kingdom, and manipulators are the quiet architects who learn how to rearrange its walls. They don't invade your world through power. They enter through permission, because before they can control what you do, they must control what you believe. Every act of manipulation begins with one purpose: to replace your inner voice with theirs. And once that's done, they don't need to command you anymore. You'll do it yourself, automatically, willingly, faithfully. The first layer, cognitive dissonance. You know something is wrong, but you also want to believe it isn't. That gap, that tension between truth and hope, is where the manipulator builds their kingdom. This psychological conflict is called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two opposing beliefs at once. And instead of facing the pain of contradiction, the mind chooses illusion. You tell yourself, they didn't mean to. They're just hurt. They'll change. But every time you rewrite reality to avoid pain, you give them more power to define it for you. That's the subtle cruelty of manipulation. You don't lose control to someone stronger. You surrender it to someone smarter at reading your denial. They feed you contradiction on purpose. Praise and insult, truth and lie, warmth and withdrawal. to keep your mind spinning in confusion. You start thinking, maybe I misunderstood. You start fixing yourself instead of questioning them. And here's the dark psychology of it. The more uncertain you feel, the more you crave their reassurance. That's not love. That's mental dependency. When confusion becomes your comfort zone, clarity feels like betrayal. The second layer, projection and deflection. When manipulators lie, they accuse you of lying. When they cheat, they question your loyalty. When they hide something, they accuse you of secrecy. This isn't coincidence. It's projection asterisk, one of the oldest defense mechanisms in the human psyche. They transfer their own darkness onto you, so they can appear clean while you carry their guilt. And because you're emotionally invested, you accept their accusations as self-reflection. You start defending yourself instead of noticing the manipulation. That's the brilliance of deflection asterisk. They make you so busy proving your innocence that you forget to question their integrity. They understand one principle better than anyone. Attention is control. Whoever dictates what the conversation is about controls the emotional direction of the relationship. So while you're explaining, defending, or apologizing, they're winning, because every minute you spend in emotional defense is a minute you're not spending in emotional awareness. The third layer, the reward loop. Every manipulator studies reward patterns. They know that the human brain releases dopamine not from pleasure, but from anticipation of pleasure. So they don't give you constant validation. They give you occasional validation. And your brain, starved of consistency, starts chasing the next high of approval. You stop doing things for yourself. You start doing them for their reaction. The subtle, almost invisible, but that's how the brain becomes rewired. You start dressing, talking, deciding, even thinking, based on how they might respond. That's not connection. That's conditioning. Here's the Machiavellian truth behind it. People are easier to control when they believe they're being rewarded. The illusion of progress is the leash that keeps them still. Manipulators use that law like kings. Reward just enough to keep you loyal. Withdraw just enough to keep you desperate. The fourth layer, the shadow trigger asterisk asterisk. Everyone has a shadow. The parts of yourself you try to hide. Your jealousy, your pride, your hunger to be seen. Manipulators don't avoid your shadow. They study it. They find the wounds you silence and turn them into buttons they can press at will. You might think you're reacting logically, but what you're really reacting to is the echo of your oldest pain. They'll say something that seems innocent, but it hits a buried nerve. You explode or you shut down, and they smile quietly because now they know exactly where your walls crack. That's when they introduce the rescue phase. They comfort you, calm you, make you feel safe again, not because they care, but because the contrast makes you dependent. The psychological yo-yoing, pain followed by peace, fear followed by relief, and it keeps you emotionally hooked. The fifth layer, learned helplessness. Eventually, you stop fighting, not because you've accepted defeat, but because your mind starts believing that resistance is pointless. This state is known as learned helplessness, a psychological phenomenon discovered through behavioral experiments. When someone experiences repeated emotional pain, with no perceived way to change it, the brain adapts by surrendering. You stop looking for exits. You stop seeking justice. You just endure. And that's how control becomes permanent. Not through fear, but through exhaustion. But here's what they never expect. Even the most conditioned mind has one last rebellion, awareness. When you start naming their tactics, the illusion begins to crumble. You stop reacting. You start recognizing. And the manipulator feels something they've never felt before. Exposure. Because manipulation only survives in shadows. The moment you shine light on it, this power dissolves. You begin to see the entire system for what it is. Not love, not loyalty, not care, but architecture. A structure built to feed their ego, sustain their insecurities, and silence your freedom. But knowledge changes the game. Because once you see the strings, you stop dancing. Here's the paradox. Manipulators don't fear confrontation. They fear clarity. They can twist your words, but they can't twist silence when it's rooted in awareness. They can distort perception, but they can't survive indifference. And that's your turning point, when you realize that walking away isn't weakness. It's an act of psychological rebellion. The reversal, when the game turns back. At first, you wanted to understand them. Now you study them. You start seeing patterns that were once invisible. The rehearsed sympathy, the timed silences, the guilt-scripted phrases. You no longer react. You record. You start collecting evidence in your mind, not to expose them, but to free yourself from their gravity. Because what they never expect is this. The moment you detach emotionally, the illusion collapses. Manipulation only works when you feel. The moment you start observing, you become untouchable. The mirror phase. It begins subtly. They sense something has shifted. Your energy no longer bends to their mood. Your silence is no longer submission, it's analysis. They start trying harder. They test your reactions, small provocations to see if the hook still holds. You respond with calm detachment, and it terrifies them. Because emotional predictability was their control system. And now their code doesn't work. You've become the mirror, reflecting their tactics back without absorbing the damage. They lie and you don't argue. They guilt trip and you don't justify. They demand emotion and you give logic. And suddenly, their power evaporates, not in confrontation, but in silence that refuses to dance. The collapse of certainty. Here's something few understand. Manipulators don't crave love. They crave control disguised as love. So when you stop giving emotional reactions, you're not depriving them of affection. You're depriving them of certainty. And nothing terrifies a manipulator more than unpredictability in their target. They start unraveling. Their tone shifts from charm to accusation. From "you've changed" to "you're cold." From "I love you" to "you've become heartless." But that's the paradox. You never changed. You just stopped performing. They'll accuse you of manipulation now. They'll say you're playing games. They'll call you distant, selfish, unrecognizable. That's projection, their favorite last defense. Because when they lose control, they redefine reality again. But this time, you don't defend. You don't argue. You simply watch like a scientist studying a familiar pattern. Because you finally understand that the person in front of you isn't a mystery. They're a mechanism. And mechanisms can only repeat themselves. The power of indifference. Detachment isn't coldness. It's clarity without chaos. You no longer need to win arguments. You no longer need to prove what they did. You no longer need closure from someone incapable of truth. You stop explaining your silence. You stop apologizing for your peace. That's when power returns, not as dominance, but as absence of need. Because the manipulator's entire system depends on one thing: your emotional participation. They need you to react, to chase, to prove. They need you to care. But when your care becomes conscious, strategic, selective, disciplined, you rewrite the script. They talk and you listen without absorbing. They provoke and you remain unreadable. They guilt and you smile quietly, not to mock, but to acknowledge the performance. And that's when the manipulator begins to fracture. The exposure effect. In psychology, there's something called the exposure effect. The more something is revealed to light, the less power it holds. Manipulators thrive in psychological fog. Ambiguity, confusion, half-truths. But once you see the machinery, the triggers, the tactics, the timing, you can't unsee it. You start recognizing manipulation everywhere. In relationships, workplaces, politics, even yourself. And that awareness reshapes you. You become sharper, colder maybe, but also freer. Because what used to control you now amuses you. What used to wound you now teaches you. And what used to silence you now fuels your discipline. The silent rebellion. The most powerful revenge isn't confrontation. It's emotional invisibility. They can't guilt you if you don't crave approval. They can't gaslight you if you don't seek validation. They can't control you if your peace no longer depends on their chaos. That's when you stop living in their game and start playing life by your own design. You learn to speak less and watch more, to withdraw strategically, not emotionally, to forgive not as mercy, but as final proof that they no longer occupy your mind. Forgiveness, in this context, isn't grace. It's closure without conversation. It's walking away without leaving breadcrumbs. The mask cracks. Sooner or later, the manipulator's mask begins to slip. They expose themselves not because you reveal them, but because they can't survive outside the script. Without control, they become restless. Without attention, they become loud. Without you, they start searching for new validation. Someone else to mirror their pain, to feed their ego. And while they repeat the same cycle with another target, you watch from a distance, calm, detached, aware. You don't wish them harm. You don't wish them closure. You just wish them away. Because sometimes the real power isn't in destroying the villain. It's in refusing to be part of their story anymore. The awakening of the observer. There's a strange peace that comes after the storm. The silence after chaos where everything finally makes sense. You realize that manipulation was never about you. It was about their fear of losing control. And all along, you were the stable one. You were the energy they couldn't manufacture. That's why they targeted you. Because your empathy was rare, your attention pure, your validation powerful. But now you've turned that empathy inward. And that's the one move manipulators can't counter. Self-loyalty. Because when you become loyal to your own peace, no one can weaponize your kindness again. They built an empire on your emotions. Now you build a fortress from your awareness. You stop explaining yourself to the world. You stop defending your boundaries. You stop chasing understanding from people who profit from confusion. Because that's when you finally learn the Machiavellian principle of survival. Control isn't taken by force. It's taken by silence. The awakening, becoming immune. You survived the mind games. You've seen the scripts, the cycles, the illusions. But survival was never the goal. The goal is evolution. Because once you've been inside a manipulator's world, you understand human psychology at its rawest level. The way fear dresses as love, how guilt hides behind care, and how power often speaks the language of kindness. Now you know the code. And once you know the code, no one can run it on you again. The shift from reaction to observation. In the early stages, you reacted to everything. Their words, their tone, their approval. All of it shaped your emotions. Now, you observe everything like a quiet strategist. You see the micro-expressions, the verbal traps, the emotional timing. When someone says, "I did everything for you," you no longer feel guilt. You analyze motive. When someone says, "You've changed," you don't defend. You recognize loss of control. This is emotional chess, and you've stopped playing checkers. The death of naivete. You were raised to believe that everyone means well, that apologies equal change, that empathy will fix people. But the truth is darker. Some people don't want healing. They want control. They don't need your love. They need your compliance. So you learn to separate compassion from permission. You can forgive someone without re-entering their orbit. You can care without being controlled. You can love without losing yourself. That's not cruelty. That's discipline. The new power, emotional minimalism. True mastery is no longer about controlling others. It's about controlling your energy distribution. You stop pouring emotion into every interaction. You conserve your reactions like currency. You invest your empathy only where it compounds. Because the manipulator's greatest enemy is the person who values their peace more than validation. The observer's calm. When you reach this level, people start noticing your change. They say, "You're too calm. You don't react anymore. You've become distant." But they don't realize you've just stopped internalizing chaos that isn't yours. You no longer argue with fools to prove intelligence. You no longer explain truth to liars seeking entertainment. You no longer beg for closure from the architect of your confusion. Because peace doesn't come from fixing others. It comes from refusing to participate in dysfunction. The new identity. Every manipulator needs a mirror. someone to reflect their illusion. When you shatter that mirror, they lose themselves. But you find yourself. You start building new boundaries not from fear, but from clarity. You become harder to manipulate, not because you've built walls, but because you've built standards. You've stopped being nice. You've started being real. And realness to manipulators feels like rejection. The transcendence. You're no longer running from them. You're not even thinking about them. Your focus has evolved from who hurt you to who you're becoming. And that's the ultimate twist in this dark psychological game. You win not by defeating the manipulator, but by evolving beyond their frequency. You no longer crave revenge. You crave stillness. You no longer need to prove your worth. You embody it. You no longer need power over others. You've mastered power over yourself. The new philosophy. You now live by a quiet code. Observe everything. Attach to nothing. React to no one. You move through life like a strategist, emotionally sovereign, mentally untouchable. You speak less because wisdom no longer needs volume. You trust slowly because energy is sacred. You choose peace not as surrender, but as strategy. You've become what every manipulator fears, someone who cannot be controlled. Because once you master your inner world, no external world can break you. The final reflection. Maybe that was the lesson all along. To go through manipulation, not to become bitter, but to become awake. To see the darkness not as punishment, but as education. And now you carry that awareness like armor. Not to fight, but to protect your peace, your purpose, your truth. You've transcended the mind games. You've seen through the illusions. You've learned the psychology of power. And you've learned how to wield it quietly. Because the ultimate mind game isn't manipulation, it's self-mastery. The manipulator's greatest mistake was teaching you how the game works. Because once you learn the rules, you stop playing. The shadow of power. Power, when stripped of morality, becomes corruption. But when fused with awareness, it becomes precision. You've spent your life reacting to other people's control. Now, for the first time, you hold the remote, not to manipulate, but to navigate, because every human interaction is a negotiation of energy, attention, emotion, validation, silence. And the person who understands these currencies becomes invisible in the system, yet influential in the outcome. That's what the manipulators never expected, that their victim would evolve into an observer, and the observer into a strategist. 1. Strategic empathy. Most people use empathy as surrender. You will use it as strategy. When you understand what someone needs to feel, you no longer get trapped in what they say. You listen beneath the words. You analyze tone, timing, emotional pattern. And you respond not emotionally, but intelligently. That's not manipulation. That's awareness turned tactical. Because empathy, when disciplined, becomes one of the sharpest tools in social intelligence. You don't fight their emotion. You direct it. You can disarm hostility with silence. You can make arrogance collapse under reflection. You can make deceit reveal itself through patience. Every manipulator's power comes from reaction. You take that away, and their entire system collapses. 2. The power of predictability. You once thought being unpredictable made you strong. It made you chaotic. Now, you become consistent, not because you're boring, but because consistency is control. When people know you can't be provoked, they stop trying. When they know your boundaries never move, they stop testing. When they know your values aren't for sale, they start respecting you or fearing you. Predictability builds psychological leverage. Tells the world, I am not moved by chaos. I am the calm. And calmness in the modern world is the loudest signal of power. 3. Selective transparency. The manipulator taught you one dangerous lesson. That information is ammunition. So now you reveal just enough. You speak in layers, not in full sentences. You let curiosity work for you. Because mystery creates psychological gravity. People chase what they can't fully define. You've learned that silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the architecture of control. The less you explain, the more they project. And their projections reveal everything you need to know. You no longer speak to be understood. You speak to be remembered. 4. Controlled vulnerability. The strongest people are not those who hide their wounds. They are those who reveal them with precision. When you show vulnerability by choice, it disarms suspicion and creates trust. But you never reveal chaos. You reveal depth. That's how leaders connect without collapsing. They humanize themselves, but never expose the levers of their power. You can say, "I've been hurt before," without ever saying by whom. You can say, "I value honesty," without declaring what you'll do when lied to. That's emotional mastery, the ability to be real, without being readable. 5. The power mirror. Every manipulator studied your reflection. Now you become the mirror. People reveal who they are in how they interpret you. So you let them speak. You let them project. You let their assumptions guide the map. The more they talk, the more their truth leaks out. You no longer chase understanding. You extract it. Silence becomes your interrogation tool. Composure becomes your disguise. And observation your ultimate form of power. You don't expose people anymore. You let them expose themselves. 6. The art of strategic detachment. Real control isn't in domination. It's in the ability to walk away without flinching. The manipulator's weapon was emotional dependency. Yours is emotional sovereignty. When you no longer need someone, you become unpredictable, and unpredictability is power. You control your attachment cycles. You master your emotional timing. You no longer react to guilt, because you've replaced approval with clarity. That's when the dynamic reverses. The manipulator becomes addicted to your indifference. You stop chasing closure. You become the closure. 7. Using the dark without becoming it. You've learned to read the shadows. Now you must decide how to use them. Power without ethics is corruption. Ethics without power is naivety. Your goal is equilibrium. You use the tools silence, empathy, precision, but never to destroy, only to defend, to navigate, to create boundaries with grace. Because the true Machiavellian doesn't crave dominance. They crave freedom. You use the dark not to manipulate others, but to protect your light. The philosopher's end. You've become both predator and monk, ruthless in awareness, merciful in intent. The old version of you was reactive. The new version is responsive, deliberate, patient. You've learned that manipulation doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from weakness. And when you see that, you stop hating the players. You simply rise above the game. Because when you understand the mechanics of control, you no longer fear being controlled. You simply choose asterisk who earns your influence. Power isn't about making others bend to your will. It's about mastering the self to such a degree that nothing external can break your rhythm. You've learned the 7 mind games. You've survived the shadow. And now you stand in perfect equilibrium. Neither light nor dark, just aware. The manipulators will still exist. The games will still continue. But now you move differently, silent, strategic, untouchable. Because power doesn't roar. It observes, calculates, it endures. And when it finally moves, it never misses. And that's the cruel beauty of power. It doesn't shout. It watches. And it always remembers.